Good morning. It's great to see everyone on this Lord's Day, and it is a beautiful Lord's Day, and great to be here and experience what to me has become what I've kind of thought of as a breath of fresh air. A breath of fresh air. I don't know if you feel the same way, or if you've thought about it in that way before, but it seems to me that life can be filled with a lot of trial and hardship. Sometimes it's just busy and crazy. Other times it's wrought with temptation and suffering and sorrow. And it becomes part of the air that we breathe. But then we get to come here and we experience this breath of fresh air, this rejuvenation, this renewing, this new life, this space where we can breathe a little deeper again and take in that breath of fresh air. I want to talk about that idea this morning and kind of meditate on that thought as we come to the table. And to do that, I want to share a story that happened about 40 years ago in modern day Ukraine. Many of you are probably aware of the events that happened at Chernobyl, the nuclear accident that happened there. But what's interesting is that Chernobyl actually started out as this crown jewel of the Soviet Union. That's at least what it was envisioned to become. There wasn't a huge populace there at that time. It was a growing population of about 50,000, but it was designed to be a place of beautiful architecture and a symbol of the brilliant, shining, ideal utopia that the Soviets had promised. And so this city with such great expectations ahead of it seemed like things were going so well until on April 6th, 1986, everything drastically changed. That morning, the workers were doing a routine test, and they realized in this test that suddenly the power in one of the reactors significantly plummeted. And so they thought to correct this error, they would turn it in the other direction, increase the power, and that resulted in a power surge that was so massive that it blew off the 1,000-ton lid that was on the reactor. And it sent Chernobyl's Unit 4 up in flames. For 6 hours, the firefighters battled the flames before finally extinguishing it, but by that point it was too late. A thick cloud had settled over Chernobyl and was spreading across Eastern Europe, carrying with it 400 times the amount of radioactive fallout that was in the atomic bomb. And it's difficult to know just how many lost their lives because of this. It's difficult to detect the effects of radiation years removed, so it's not known exactly how many people were truly affected by this, but the city was, of course, immediately evacuated and condemned to this day. Now, some will go, you can pull up online and see videos of this eerie ghost town today. But this once thriving, hopeful metropolis that was brilliant and splendorous and beautiful with so much expectation had now become this dystopian wasteland. And in that sense, it's a tragic and really disturbing story, as this place just became quite literally disfigured in every way imaginable. But what's interesting and what a lot of people don't know is that it actually should have been much, much worse. See, when they finally put out the flames, there was still within Chernobyl's Unit 4 a sort of smoldering, molten flow of radioactive metal that was beginning to seep its way down. And beneath that reactor was a massive pool of water. Now, originally that pool of water was there to keep the reactors from overheating. But now, if that molten radioactive lava of sorts were to seep down into that pool of water, it would result in a subsequent explosion, setting off the other 3 reactors and generating an explosion so powerful that scientists estimated that it would have rendered over half of Europe uninhabitable for the next several thousand years. And so, in order to prevent this even greater catastrophe from happening, they needed someone to go in, back into Chernobyl, back into this power plant, to turn off the valve, or to loosen the valve, rather, and let that pool of water run dry. And it seemed like an impossible mission, as you can imagine. The great problem was that within the basement of this power plant, it had become a pool of water that was about waist high. And so in this dark, chaotic wasteland of a basement that was now filled waist high with water, someone would have to go into that, find the valve, and turn off release it so that the water could run dry. And one reporter described it as, this would be like finding a needle in a haystack, an impossible mission. And by all estimates, one that everyone viewed as essentially a suicide mission. But 3 men finally bravely stepped forward and volunteered. Their names, which I'll do my best to pronounce, were Alexei Ananenkov, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. And together the 3 men strapped on their wetsuits, and they begin wading through the chaotic maze of radioactive waste. And as they did that, they eventually saw this light blinking in the darkness. And they knew that that light, which was on a pipe, they knew that that eventually led to the valve that they needed. So they felt their way through the dark, chaotic waters before finally finding this valve, turning it loose, and allowing that pool of water to run dry, saving untold millions of lives. And it's an incredible story. And what's remarkable is that surprising everyone involved, they actually survived this mission, and they all went on to live long, prosperous lives, celebrated for their heroism and bravery. And it's one of those inspiring stories. There's all kinds of movies and TV shows, I believe, that focus on this today, although I think they're a little bit dramatized, which is like amazing that you can dramatize a nuclear accident. But if you want to learn more about it, there's a lot of content out there. But what's interesting about stories like this one is not just that they're inspiring or captivating or compelling in some way, but ultimately that these heroic stories provide some kind of analogy, I believe, for us to see Christ. And here's what I mean by that. Not to compare the Garden of Eden to a Soviet utopia, but wasn't the world originally intended to be that beautiful, paradisal city of God? And not just a place of material splendor and glory, but an atmosphere of love and trust and belonging and intimacy, a place of peace and wholeness and perfection in the presence of God. And when Adam and Eve sinned, it wasn't just that as a consequence they were kicked out of the garden. The ultimate consequence was that they brought a curse upon all creation. In other words, when Adam and Eve sinned, it was like a nuclear reactor had been set off. And the effects of that sin lingered like a thick cloud over the world, becoming the very air that we breathe, disfiguring and corrupting God's good creation, and in some real sense, deforming the very image of God in us. And I don't believe it's quite right to say that we inherit their sin, but I do believe it's right to say that we breathe in the air of their sin and all the effects of it. The sickness, the disease, the sorrow, the pain, the loss, death, all these a consequence of the sin-clouded world that we now experience. And what could be done to save it? Right? As we breathe in and breathe out the toxic air of this sin-clouded world, what could be done to make this right? Well, not 3 men who risked their lives to save half of Europe, but 1 man who gave his life to save all the world. See, Jesus stepped into our radioactive world, not in some hazmat suit, distancing himself from us, but taking on our flesh and dwelling right here with us in the midst of it. But Jesus' mission was not just to keep things from getting worse, prevent some greater disaster from occurring. No, Jesus' mission was to reverse it, to reverse the curse. And listen to how Paul talks about this in Romans 5 in verse 12. He says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through the one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." Then verse 15, "But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. For if because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ?" Do you hear what Paul is saying there? Through Adam, sin and death spread to all men, to all humanity. And what Jesus came to do was not just keep that from getting worse, not just prevent the spread, not just prevent some greater disaster from occurring. No, Paul says he came to reverse that. He came to reverse the curse of sin and death in the world. In other words, Jesus came to breathe in our air of sin and death so that he could breathe out into our world his life. He draws our air into himself in order to cleanse it and renew it. Now, for a time, that cloud still lingers. And we feel the effects of it. Week by week, we feel the effects of our sin-clouded world. But one day, Jesus will come again, and the whole world will be fully and finally rid and dispelled of that curse, and we will breathe in the breath of heaven. And until that day, we come around this table and we experience that breath of fresh air. Because by his dying breath, we breathe in the life of God. And so before we partake this morning, I want to close with a poem that's written by Malcolm Guite that I believe captures this idea and that I hope will center our minds as we partake. The dark nails pierce him, and the sky turns black. We watch him as he labors to draw breath. He takes our breath away to give it back, return it to its birth through his slow death. We hear him struggle, breathing through the pain, who once breathed out his spirit on the deep, who formed us when he mixed the dust with rain and drew us into consciousness from sleep. His spirit and his life he breathes in all, mantles his world in his one atmosphere, and now he comes to breathe beneath the pall of our pollutions, draw our injured air to cleanse it and renew. His final breath breathes and bears us through the gates of death. We'll now ask the men to come forward as we partake.